Okay. Now this is almost to the very beginning. You know, Homo sapiens came out of Africa and went to Europe, and there they spread. So this area, which is almost Ukraine, you see it's almost like a central point for the distribution of Homo sapiens in Europe. So this is 44,000 years. At the end of the last ice age, people start settling down. Before they were all nomads, hunter-gatherers, then about 10,000 years, agriculture starts in Mesopotamia, almost Iran. So Ukraine here is like a central point.
Is Ukraine the hot
Ukraine is like, let me show you where it is. If you see the Black Sea, see this is the Black Sea, and this is Crimea. This is today's Ukraine. So you see, this is where basically this Slavic country. Later on, I'll get to that region. This is the Caspian Sea, Persian Gulf, Iran, Mediterranean, Anatolia. So it's good to know this perspective because it will come again in many of the maps I will show. You can pull some chairs from outside and bring it over. There are some smaller chairs. Okay. Now, this was, again, if you can locate the Black Sea, so you know where Ukraine is. This is 750 to 250 BC. There is what we call the Indo-Europeans, or Aryan people, ruling that area. So this was basically the area we call Persian Empire. So you see that they have found artifacts from these groups in Crimea, specifically. Again, I go forward in the timeline. Here again is where it calls Slavonic tribes and the Khazar Empire. The Khazars, see the Caspian Sea in Iran, we call it the Khazar Sea. The Khazars were a Turkic tribe from the east that come and take over that area. And they are actually the ones who converted to Judaism. So basically, then later on, they formed the Ashkenazis. So basically, this is where the theory of the pure blood in Israel is debunked, because these are converted people who went to Europe, not the original Jews from Palestine. That's besides the point. I'm going on the tangent on history. I'm a student of history. So.
When was that?
This thing?
When did they convert it?
They converted, I think, right about that time when you see this empire, they extended to Europe later. I mean, this is right after, this is just about Christ, I think. Now, here again, another map of this Slavonic people, 6th century. You see they come all the way to the east, and they're forming their territory above Ukraine and to the west. Another map. Okay, this is an important history because there are these, from the Slavonic tribes, there is this group called Kievan Rus. And they appear in what is called Kiev today. So basically, Kiev is the start of Russia. That's the point, my point. Slavic people for a long time had no government, and they were always taken, captured as slaves. I mean, the word slave actually comes from the term Slav. So there was no government to protect them. But at this point, they form a government in Kiev. Originally, Slavic people are Vikings. They come from Viking tradition, and they're all pagan at this time. Again, another historical trade route, which shows the Khazar Khanate. Later, now you see there is Byzantine Empire, Roman, and in Iran there is Abbasid Empire. So it's still, Russian states are forming, but still under the Khazars. Khazars, by the way, today in Afghanistan, there are a group of people, they call them Hazare. That's another name for Khazars. Okay, here again, this is more recent, this is 1600. Now, the Turkish tribes formed a Crimean Khanate in Crimea, basically. And now you see there is no mention of Ukraine, and just Russia has started as Muscovy in that area. And there is Poland, Moldova, and there is Ottoman Empire. Today, when you go to Crimea, you see this city is made by the Ottomans, and they have Persian names. Ottomans like to use Persian, like Bakhchisarai, that city that's in the map. It's in Persian. Bagh means garden, Bakhchi is small garden. Sarai is the house, so it's a house with a small garden. It's actually a castle for the king, modestly called a small garden. Okay, now 19th century. Here it's called New Russia, and basically what is Ukraine today. And Crimea is still under the Ottoman Empire. And now this is the Russian Empire expansion to all these regions. And you see in the left, again, that take over the Crimea. And all these colors, it has details of which years they were annexed. Alexander, Nicholas, Alexander I, Alexander II, Alexander III, which areas they captured. So Peter the Great had said, I want Russia to reach the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Well, that never happened. They tried to take Iran. Now here is again the territorial evolution of Ukraine. The timeline: 1922, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republics. 1939, Polish territory given to Ukraine. 1940, Romanian territories given to Ukraine. 1945, Czechoslovak given to Ukraine. 1948, Romanian territory. 1954, Russia and Crimea given to Ukraine. Now, there is historical process of this. If you are familiar with the discussions between Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg over nationalism, there are all extensive debates. Rosa Luxemburg was against nationalism of Ukraine. She called it a bourgeois entity, but Lenin wanted it to have a nationality of itself. So Lenin actually is the cause of Ukraine becoming a nation. So this year was the 100th anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg. That's why I went to a conference about that in Ukraine. And so those discussions were repeated again about that. Yes?
There's definitely a point that the Russian language and the Ukrainian language are very closely related, but they are definitely separate languages, and they actually use a slightly different alphabet.
Yes, that's true. It is still very close. Like,
Yeah, it's very
the,
close.
the word Ukraine means the outer land. So it's basically like, the borderland of Russia. But again, Russia started in Ukraine, so they are closely knit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, again, the development of this area. Now, if you see, there is this big river in the middle of Ukraine cutting the country in two halves. And this is basically what you see today is the differences, almost like a civil war. If you go there in the east side, all the streets have old Soviet names, Marx, Lenin. But in the west side, they have changed all that. It's all Shevchenko, she's a poet, and some other things, or freedom. So, and historically, the east side was loyal to Russia and Soviet Union. The west side actually sided with Hitler during the war, and that's why they have these groups of neo-Nazis and fascists that grew there, and they basically hated everybody else except for Ukrainian. They were against Polish people, against Russians, against even their own Jewish people. They wouldn't consider Jewish people their own people. In their passports, if someone is Jewish, it's written nationality Jewish. So when I was there, I asked, well, Trotsky was Ukrainian. Why didn't you have a monument for Trotsky? They said, no, he was Jewish. So they make a distinction about this. And Rosa Luxemburg was Jewish, so.
But how about language on either side of the
Again, the east side prefers Russian and Russian speakers. On the west side, they prefer Ukrainian and even Polish. Some part of it was part of Poland. And that previous map showed.
Do some people on the east speak Ukrainian too?
Yeah. Ukrainian was their official language in school. They learned both languages.
Is there a strong economical difference?
Yes, all the industrial main heavy factories are in the east. Yeah. Okay, this is basically a timeline that I spoke through the maps. So you see it starts from Persian Empire, then Greek settlement, then Roman Empire, then the Khazars, then Slavs, which Kievan Rus starts in 882 AD. And then Vladimir is the first person to become Christian. Before that they were pagans. And Vladimir had many choices because this is rather a new country for that region. You see, 988 AD, he decides to become Christian. And he compares all the religions around him, and he said, well, one doesn't eat pork, and one, the priest cannot marry. He just rejects some of them. He finds that he likes the Orthodox Christian, the best one that he likes. The priest could marry, they could eat pork, so it was.
So that's basically
He found it.
That's basically Russian Orthodox.
Yes. Well, then the Mongols come, then the Ottoman Empire, and then Crimean Khanate, Russian Empire, and the meaning of Ukraine meaning borderland, and the Crimean War is very famous. Catherine the Great starts the port of Sevastopol, which becomes the port for the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, and it saw those wars.
Was Catherine the Great, was she in the 1783
Yeah,
time period?
after, yeah. And so Crimea, I'll see later on. Okay, this is today's map. The flag has those two colors. The bottom yellow symbolizes the rich agriculture, the rich land that they have. The soil is dark black, just the opposite of what the soil we have here. anything grows in Ukraine. So, and the wheat has big product, export, the big export, and the top blue is for the sky. So basically, the wheat field is their flag today.
Oh, Kiev is right on the river.
Exactly, yeah. And you see Chernobyl up there, where
Yeah.
there was a nuclear incident. And again, you see here the river divides the country into two halves, which divides everything else as far as their ethnicity and language usage. Yeah.
I was under the impression that Poland at one point controlled down through Kiev in the
Mhm.
western part of Ukraine.
Yes, they did. I think I was showing it. And everything was some other country. There was no Ukraine.
Yeah,
And it was all given back, many of it through the persuasion of during Soviet Union. When they formed this nationality, then they added to it. The last one being Crimea was only added in 1954 by Khrushchev. See, in 53, Stalin dies, and then Khrushchev comes and he does this de-Stalinization. And during the war, as I mentioned, the west side of Ukraine sided with Hitler. So Stalin, to punish them, took away the wheat product of that year, so there was a big famine, millions died in Ukraine. So Khrushchev, to make up for some of that, he gives Crimea to Ukraine without any referendum or anything. And I think because he and his wife were Ukrainian in origin. But they were thinking, well, it's all Soviet Union anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. But this year, when Russia claims it again, Gorbachev actually says that Putin corrected the mistake that Khrushchev did in '54, actually by giving it like that. Here, this the discussion between Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin that makes Ukraine part of the Soviet Union and gives it a nationality. And then again that argument about Crimea given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in '54. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, what happens was that the two Germanys are connected again and follow the Berlin Wall. And there is this meeting in Malta between George Bush and Gorbachev. And they trick Gorbachev. They use the scare tactic. They say, well, now that Germany is united, you don't want that big Germany again, do you? I mean, Russia lost 20 million people in the Second World War. So they said, for them not to become big again, let them be in NATO. We'll keep an eye on them so that they can never get big and strong. Gorbachev agrees to that, but he says, not one more inch you can go further east from there. And this was verbally agreed. There was nothing signed, but this was verbally agreed. Now this I get from Ray McGovern, who was CIA in charge of Soviet affairs at the time, and he knew all this. You might not have heard this a lot in the media. It was kind of silenced, but I heard it from him, so I'm putting it here. But this is very critical, because Gorbachev was basically deceived, because you see what happens after that. NATO expands eastward. Again, Gorbachev writes that in some letters. He said, we were supposed to dismantle the Warsaw Pact. You were supposed to dismantle the NATO Pact. Not only you didn't dismantle the NATO Pact, you even added countries from the Warsaw Pact into the NATO Pact. See, one after another, they came, and then all the way to their backyard in Ukraine. So,
Surprise, surprise.
yeah, this is the historical. Then Clinton adds more countries. Ray McGovern says, well, he asks his aides, did we have any agreement to not to do this? And no, there's no such thing, there's nothing signed. So he says, okay, then let's add these countries. Then they have future plans. They want to add Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Azerbaijan into EU and NATO, basically. So this new bailout offer they gave during this last year crisis was that it had strings attached. If Ukraine was to join EU, then they also had to join military pacts like NATO and also IMF loans. Here's some details of some recent events. In 2004, Yanukovych who was prime minister then, he became president, but he was another oligarch and corrupt. So people went in the streets again, or to that circle, which they call Maidan in Kiev, and they called that the Orange Revolution. And they made the other candidate, Yushchenko, the president, with Timoshenko. Now, you see, according to Guardian, which foreign entities were active there. There's a U.S. State Department, USAID, National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, International Republican Institute, NGO Freedom House, George Soros Open Society Institute, and National Endowment for Democracy were active then, and again, we'll see them active again this year in 2014 events in the Maidan. Well, again, Yushchenko was a corrupt president, and Timoshenko went to jail. So people not voted again for Yanukovych in 2010. So he was democratically elected president with 48% of votes. And he also had this support of the Communist Party of Ukraine, which was actually the old Stalinist Communist Party. And this was like the official opposition, funded again by the government. It was like a fake opposition. And this party was the same Stalinist party of the old people. This is what I learned from visiting there, that there is actually an independent left over there called the left opposition. And they include Trotskyists, anarchists, trade unionists, and Rosa Luxemburg supporters. And they had these conferences in November 2013 that I attended, which was very interesting. They didn't support the current or the previous governments, or the current or the previous communist parties. They called them all Stalinists. So they were really genuine leftist people there. Okay, then Yanukovych decides not to go with the EU offer, and because it had strings attached. Instead, he decides to go with the Russian Eurasian Economic Union suggestion, which is treaty signed, but still not going to effect until 1st of January of next year. And already it has Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia in it. They want to include Ukraine in it, and later on Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan showed interest to join that. This was what Yanukovych wanted to do. Yes?
Now, who were those protesters that started in November?
Oh, well, people basically. And I mean, there are all kinds of groups at this stage. It was very democratic. All kinds of opposition were there. Later on, this is taken over by the right wing. The right sector and the fascists take over by using their military arm to shoot people. But at this stage, this is like very democratic. A lot of people were there who were against Yanukovych. Is a corrupt president. You know, just like the whole tradition of a series of corrupt oligarchs, basically millionaires, and today there's another one. They were ruling Ukraine. You know, so, and people thought, well, maybe European Union would be a better choice, not knowing the strings that are attached to that. So anyway, what happens is that what can be called a coup. When people come to the street, but then this right sector and the Svoboda party come into action. They bring their guns and they start threatening people and shooting people. The Kiev police had no guns at the time. And these people started shooting, they brought sharpshooters, and they shot from both sides. So a chaos was formed. Again, with the influence of those organizations active in Ukraine. So anyway, Yanukovych is forced to escape. Even though there was a date set for an election, but these, the right-wing groups say, no, we have to take over the government, and yes, we do. So, now I'm going to talk about the Crimea demographics, which, as you see, the majority are Russians. And it has a history, which I explained, was set up by Catherine the Great at the Sevastopol, the Russian fleet. Russian fleet was always there. They had leased the place. And some incident that's interesting happened when Russia was at war with Georgia. The current government of Ukraine under Yushchenko officially sided with Georgia because Yushchenko was under US influence. But the fleet in Sevastopol went to fight Georgians from Sevastopol. So Yushchenko had put a plaque in honor of Georgians in Crimea. When that fleet came back, Russian crowd, people went to greet the Russian soldiers and with Russian flags, and they took that plaque and threw it into the Black Sea. So you could see the majority of Russians in Crimea basically not liking the policy of the Ukrainian government at that time. Then this referendum was held on March 16. It had foreign observers, and they say 96.7% for integration of the region back into the Russian Federation, and the turnout was 83%.
Why? Oh.
So you said there were foreign observers.
Yes.
So this election was viewed as legitimate from the outside. Okay. And
Like
that-
which outside?
Well,
Well-
even from, yeah,
I
that's a good
think-
question. Which outside? From the west, even the west, there were foreign observers from the west?
Observers were from everywhere, yeah. So
Oh.
there were, yeah. You had a question?
Well, I was just like, why did they want to go back to
Oh.
Russia?
Okay. Well, you see what happened with that move by EU and NATO to come to Ukraine, basically, and that takeover of that government. So Russia could not lose that major port in the Black Sea. That's a very strategic point.
That's why Russia wants Crimea. Why do the Crimeans want Russia?
Well, but Crimeans were majority Russians.
So
If you
that's
see
what
in
you're
this-
saying, okay, right, okay.
They always had Russians there, and Russia requested the coming back of Crimea because of the danger of losing the port to NATO. As I said, they came all the way back to Russia's backyard, and Russia could not see a major port be lost to NATO, just like everything else. It was like, basically, they put them against the wall, you know.
I mean, my understanding is that a lot of observers in the West did not consider that referendum to be particularly fair. But at least the reports that I heard on NPR seem to indicate that there was a lot of questions about it. And there's certainly an issue of the Tatar population being totally oppressed in that area. I mean, they were deported during World War II from there.
Yeah, they were, and then Putin has said now that they can go back. But I was in Crimea. At that time, it was even an autonomous republic. The Tatars who are Muslim, they could have several wives. They had a lot of freedom in their affairs. But again, the majority, as you see with the demographics, the majority were Russian.
Yeah.
And so it's not a very unusual thing to see majority Russian people wanting to go back to Russia. But besides the point that Russian pension is more than Ukrainian pension. So you can see there, you know, the senior citizen would easily go there. Yeah.
And I also, if I remember right, because I took a class at this at the university, but one of the reasons that there's such a large Russian population is because the sailors who served at that port liked it so much that they decided to stay. So I heard that was another reason that it's so predominantly Russian.
Yeah, but I mean, it is for predominantly Russian, so it's not a very unusual thing to see them wanting to go to Russia. I mean, you know, the first thing this new government in Kiev did is to ban Russian language. See, that is not, you know, going to settle with Russian people. You know, and I've seen how they react to things. Like in a store, if you say something in the Russian name, if that's the only thing I have practiced, sometimes they resist the Ukrainian, you know. There is that sort of antagonism there. So, and it's not fair, you know. Yes?
Do we have any idea in the 3.3 3.75% vote, what demographic group that would have come from, or is it across the board? How do you?
Oh, well, you see from the Tatars apparently sided with Ukrainians. So that comes from these, the top three basically are the majority, I mean, in the statistics.
So the bottom floor may have been in the opposition vote, the losing vote?
Yeah, but there are not that many.
But the
So-
news reports were saying that the Tatars were afraid to express their point of view at all. That they were being intimidated.
I don't know, there's all kinds of commentary. You have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask, if you had any idea for that 83.1% turnout, you know, what the demographic was for that, and
Oh, I think,
if you know, like, why exactly the Ukrainians and the Tartars would agree with this Russian vote, because that is like
It's more than the Russians.
majority.
yeah, it's more than the Russian population. Well, again, I said, the pension under Russian government is more, so that could be a reason. If you're a senior citizen, you're on pension, you might want to get a bigger paycheck, you know, so that could be, it's my guess. You had a question here?
Oh, sorry, no, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay. So then there is referendums in Donetsk and Lugansk region where they have called established a People's Republic. Now this is the two regions that are fighting right now, daily. And this is where that plane was shut down. Then another oligarch, Petro Poroshenko, is elected president on May 25th. So he's a chocolate man. I went to his chocolate store called Roshan, very nice. It has a demonstration how they make this chocolate. And, he's 50 years old, but he's like multi-billionaire.
Are the people, did that represent the will of the people in that area?
What? Oh, those two?
Yeah.
Well, that's, again, it's there in the east side, mostly Russian speakers. So,
And then so that they wanted to, the people who lived there
in Lugansk and Donetsk.
in Donetsk and Lugansk.
Well, this is where it is they're fighting right now. I mean, government, Ukraine has sent troops, and these people are fighting. There are regions that the government cannot go in. But then this government has killed women, children, discriminate bombing of city and residential areas, because there is no other target.
So we can't have you, the Russians aren't going to get you either, huh?
Well, it's sort of a massacre going on, but you only hear it if you watch the other side of the news. You don't see it in the Western news. You watch RT, you get all the videos.
Now, are there any natural resources at issue there? Is there more gas, is there a lot of gas up there?
No, they don't have their own gas. They get their gas from Russia.
Okay.
That's the thing. The pipeline goes through there, but still Russia has an alternate pipeline too. There are factories in the east and coal mines. So I don't know if that can be a reason for one side wanting it or not. I think mostly it's the hegemony, basically. I mean, U.S. wants its hegemony, and Russia wants.
Oh, we're behind that.
Well, I want to get to that in a later. See now, this is what Samir Amin comments. He's saying that this Eurasian project is in conflict with the Triad. He calls the Triad U.S., Western and Central Europe, and Japan. They want to take over the world, basically a unipolar world they want. And so anybody who stands against that, they call it an enemy. You know Samir Amin, he is in charge of the Third World Research Forum. He's Egyptian, but lives in Senegal. And he writes often in Monthly Review. And therefore, this is basically the context, international context of what's going on.
I have a question.
Yes.
Just from a public policy perspective, what is the most socially just democratic solution to? I mean, I'm sure you're going to get to that, but
To this?
yeah.
Well, I am for autonomous regions, and referendum is the most democratic way. You should ask people what they want in
Yeah.
every region, and it should be fair and democratic. I think that's the most democratic thing you can do. Ask people of any region, what do you want? What do you want to do? So if you ask me, yeah. But in general, well, okay, I'm almost to the end. You know what this development that happened just this month? The BRICS countries met in Brazil, and they made an alternative development bank to the World Bank and IMF. Now this is a big change to take us from the unipolar world to the multipolar world. This is what is ideal, to have a multipolar world, not just a unipolar world under the US hegemony and US dominance. And you see when Brazil and, Russia and China made this deal, gas deal, they agreed it in rubles, not in dollars. So that's a major change also. So these countries, you know, the Latin American countries, with Brazil included, they all came out of the World Bank IMF chokehold by paying off all their debts and making their own markets with Mercosur, with Brazil, Argentina in it. There is ALBA in Central America with Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. They're all members of that, and the condition to join is to have no debt to World Bank IMF. See, when the U.S. was busy in Iraq, these Latin American countries, one after another, became leftists and they got out of the World Bank IMF control. Yes.
Just a little snippet of a news article I saw with Crimea, when Russia was back in control of Crimea, was that the four branch banks of the Kiev private central bank were closed by Russia, and they reopened as a part of the Russian banking system. That was so revealing to me that you were mentioning the conflict with the International Monetary Fund and the Western neoliberal.
Right, right. This is basically,
So was this current, was it 17 billion EU loan, wasn't most of that primarily to service the debt from the previous EU type of loans, Western loans, that were not being able to be repaid, that Ukraine had?
yes, and also Ukraine owes the gas money to Russia.
$1 billion to Russia.
Yeah, so
Are they gonna have their own currency?
these countries, I think that's the top.
What's their currency gonna be, the ruble or?
Well, between China and Russia, that agreement was in rubles.
Yeah.
But see, the bank is headquartered in Shanghai, so they might talk about a new currency. I don't know. I don't think it has been discussed yet. But Howard Switzer, who is here, he had a workshop on money last convention. He's the expert on money.
Just to, I guess, play devil's advocate, what's standing in the way of a single, pluralistic, multi-ethnic country or state? You know, for instance, you know, Israel or the U.S. even, you know, with a beacon of democracy, but you know, a truly democratic unitary state, that honors the pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multicultural. I mean, is that possible in this situation, or?
It's ideal. This is what actually we're calling for Israel. Our colleague, Dr. Justine McCabe, gave that paper at the Left Forum, that single state is the only solution left, because they have basically destroyed any possibility for a two-state. So yeah, this is what we're calling for Israel-Palestine. Something like the model of South Africa. It's one country for all. No preference to any religion or ethnicity. It's not a Jewish state or a Muslim state. It's a secular state for all. I mean, these are ideal things. This is what Gandhi wanted for India, but the British said, "Oh no, there's 5 Indias." So they managed to carve it.
Can that be applied to this situation?
Of course, it can be applied. These people actually now, the two Lugansk and Donetsk republics, they want autonomous regions like a federation, so that they can have their own rule outside from Kiev pressure to speak their own language, to have their own policy. This is what ideally, that's what they want. They don't want to secede to Russia, and Russia doesn't want to claim that region. They are only calling for autonomy. Yes.
Well, wasn't the parts of Ukraine a center of military, the Soviet military-industrial complex, particularly in aerospace? Wasn't there a lot of...
Not the aerospace. Well, there are universities that have defense research, like Kharkov University.
I mean, some of the other things, hasn't the U.S. attempted to put anti-missile, ballistic missile systems into the Ukraine supposedly to protect from Iranian nuclear-armed missiles? I don't know who, but isn't that perceived by a part of the Russians as as a veiled threat to their own nuclear arsenal?
Well, Ukraine has some nuclear missiles, not a whole lot, but some, and they're protected.
I thought they eliminated nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
I think they still have some left, because they were talking about using it, but they're not significant. Maybe just a little bit.
I think what he's thinking about is Poland and Czechoslovakia, where the U.S. was trying to get anti-ballistic missiles there. I'm not sure the status of that, whether that happened or not. There was.
I think that got canceled.
About that. Yeah.
I think that was canceled. Yeah, they canceled it.
So, I mean, yeah, so devolution, fine for making Eastern Ukraine creating autonomous republics that sort of fall under a federal Ukraine structure. But what sort of precedent does it set to allow these regions? I mean, it was a military, it was action taken by paramilitary groups in Ukraine, in Donetsk, in Crimea, in Luhansk, before there were any elections. And I think we can debate more of the legitimacy of those elections. I mean, sure, observers thought they were legitimate. I mean, save for the fact that it violated the constitution of the sovereign state to even have the election. So what sort of precedent do we set by allowing, I mean, so is the Green Party then supposed to support autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk the way that they did it? I mean, it seems to me that's totally legitimate.
The talk about autonomy has come in many places. U.S. supported Kosovo independence. Well, when it's on the U.S. side, they have no problem with it. But when it's on the other side, and then there is talk about Scotland, autonomy, and then there are many countries have autonomous claims. There are many. Well, one guy actually have a talk. There are 3,000 nations in the world and only 200 countries. Many of these nations are
Right.
stateless.
Right.
So there are a lot of claims for autonomy in the world.
But the move to autonomy here was fundamentally unilateral and violent. I mean, yes, they voted, right? They voted under the gun, like after these paramilitary groups had already seized power. I mean, so are we going to support these?
Not in Crimea. Crimea, as I showed you, was always Russian, with the majority Russian population.
Right.
So there was no paramilitary takeover.
That's precisely what happened. I mean, it was these paramilitary groups took over the bases. Then there was a vote that was not arbitrated by the federal government in Kiev. It was arbitrated by these paramilitary groups in Crimea. Right.
But they are their own paramilitary. I'm saying they're not foreign.
Even that's
entities.
debated. But even if they were domestic, I mean, that's not democratic. It's not democratic to allow people with guns to take over the government, right? And then say we're going to hold this election.
So you're saying when they voted to stay with Russia, that they were doing that under some fear because of,
That's the narrative. I mean, that's the narrative. That's
That's the Western narrative.
Narrative.
And I just think it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't addressed. I mean, and I think that. I mean, just even fundamentally. I mean, I think that that's like an empirical truth that this election happened after these paramilitary groups had seized the military bases.
Eastern Ukraine or Crimea?
In both.
In both?
In both.
Well, it's very different. See, Crimea, as I showed you, is mostly Russian.
Right.
It was
Well, there's-
only given to Ukraine in 1954. That's like just 60 years ago. So there is really no Ukrainian legitimacy to Crimea. It was given by Khrushchev, who's a Soviet
The
leader.
legitimacy is that we have this contemporary state, and that's
Yeah.
the border of that state.
Right.
And these people just decided,
You mean
right,
the
that
Ukrainian government that got overthrown violently in February?
no, well, okay, so there was an election.